Glenn Beck.
The Blaze Radio Network.
Taxes have been wildly unpopular in America since the imposition of the very first tax, the Navigation Act, in 1651. It basically prohibited the colonies from trading with anyone other than Great Britain. By the time Britain imposed the Sugar and Stamps Act during the mid-1700s, the colonists had pretty much had their fill of taxation without representation. In fact, they would later decide that they didn't much care for taxation with representation. Thus, when the Constitution was written and ratified, the only taxes allowed by America's founding document were to pay the debt and provide for the common defense and general welfare. The welfare specified meant general well-being of the people, not government handouts to people who didn't work for a living. At the country's inception, the only taxes endured by the American citizens came from tariffs and a few internal taxes on distilled spirits, carriages, sugar, tobacco, and snuff, property sold at auction, corporate bonds, and slaves. During the War of 1812, when Britain threatened to bring an end to American independence just a few decades after it had been so hard won, when the White House in Washington, D.C. was burned to the ground, and the British troops attacked from the north, from Canada, and the south at New Orleans. With the cost of the war skyrocketing, Congress imposed America's first sales tax, but even then, just on gold, silverware, and jewelry. Amazingly, in 1817, several years after the War of 1812 had been won, Congress ended all internal taxation on Americans, including sales tax, relying solely on tariffs on imported goods to fund the government. It wasn't until the Civil War of 1862, in order to pay for an increasingly high cost of the war, that the United States Congress adopted America's first income tax. For wage earners between $600 and $10,000, it was 3%, higher for those making over $10,000. Sales and excise taxes were imposed, as well as the nation's first inheritance tax. The Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Office was also created and granted the power to levy and collect taxes, a power the Constitution had given solely to the United States Congress. Revenue did jump up to its highest levels in history, $310 million by 1866. Still, in 1872, with the Civil War long over, Congress then eliminated the income tax. Before the era of progressivism, Congress actually seemed to pay some attention to the United States Constitution. During economic hard times of 1894 and 1895, the income tax made a brief comeback. However, it didn't last long, because the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the income tax was unconstitutional, as it was not apportioned among the states in conformity with the Constitution. And once again, the federal government made do with the taxes on tobacco and alcohol. Then came the era of progressivism. Progressive Republican William Howard Taft pushed for a constitutional amendment. And after progressive Democrat Woodrow Wilson was elected president in 1912, the progressive income tax advocates finally had their way. In 1913, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution made the income tax permanent. The amendment gave Congress the legal authority to tax income and resulted in a revenue law that taxed incomes of both individuals and corporations. Advocates promised that the highest tax rate would never climb above 7%. But just 2 years later, it was already 15%. Then came World War I. Once again, the federal government made the case that rates must be raised to finance a war effort. And in 1916, the top rate leapt from 15 to 67%. And the next year, 77%. Then, in 1920, Warren Harding was elected, followed after his untimely death in 1923 by Calvin Coolidge.
The expenses of the government reach everybody. Taxes take from everyone a part of his earnings and force everyone to work for a certain part of his time for the government. I want to cut down public expense. I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves. I want them to have the rewards of their own industry. This is the chief meaning of freedom.
The two constitutional presidents fought to and succeeded in cutting spending by 50% and pushed to lower income tax rates. Their efforts went from a deeper depression to kicking off the roaring 20s in 18 months. By 1925, the tax rate had been slashed from 77% to 25%. Throughout our nation's history, the wealthy have been punished with egregious taxes each time the country entered a crisis stage. Under Progressive Democrat FDR, taxes were again raised on top earners during the Great Depression, boosting them back up to 63%. But nothing could compare to the unbelievable burden placed on the most successful Americans in 1944, when the federal government raised the top tax rate to 94% of every dollar earned over $200,000.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Well, that and a government that steals almost all of a person's paycheck. Adjusted for inflation, $200,000 was equivalent to $2.5 million today. So someone who had earned through the fruits of their own labor, knowledge, and skill, $2.5 million only took home $150,000 plus $100,000 from the lower 50% tax rate on their tier below 200. So their total tax burden wound up being right around 90%. They were able to keep only $250,000 of the $2.5 million that they had produced. Whatever you believe about how much a person needs to make or income inequality, it's difficult to believe that there are too many Americans who believe that it is right and moral for a government to confiscate all but 6 to 10% of what someone has worked for. No matter what the social, economic, and peace or wartime conditions in America over the following 3 decades, the top federal income tax rate never dropped below 70%. But the 1980s saw a revival of constitutional thought, and the thought that Americans deserve to keep much more of what they actually earned in order to support their families. In 1981, the highest rate fell from 70 to 50%. And then in 1986, the top tax rate was lowered to 28%. That move also came with a promise from lawmakers that they would never have to raise that rate again. In fact, during the 1988 campaign, presidential candidate George H.W. Bush said,
"My opponent now says he'll raise them as a last resort or a third resort. But when a politician talks like that, you know that's one resort he'll be checking into." And my opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no, and they'll push, and I'll say no, and they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips.
That promise lasted nearly 2 full years. Bush struck a deal with Congress to raise taxes in 1990. It should be noticed that the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, right after the abolition of all private property, is a progressive or graduated income tax. The United States of America has adhered to that communist plank since 1913. It's also interesting that the very nation that first instituted communism, the original practitioners of Marxist theory, Russia, has long since, in fact, back in 1998, abandoned the progressive or graduated income tax in favor of a flat tax of 13%. In Russia, everyone pays the same 13% tax rate. How is that fair? Well, 13% of 1 million is 130,000. 13% of 10,000 is 1,300. Millionaires still actually pay a lot more. What a concept. But apparently in America, there are some who are more committed to the communist principles of governance than the original communists. For those who are wondering how the Russian economy fared after so drastic a change, Russian revenue grew by 28%. Tomorrow, the effects of massive income tax rates. Do they help or hurt the economy and a country's people?
Glenn Beck.
This is the Glenn Beck Program.
Americans hear the refrain virtually every day from left-wing sources like socialist Bernie Sanders.
If we do not make the necessary changes to reduce skyrocketing wealth and income inequality, this country, in my view, is well on its way to becoming an oligarchic form of society, a nation in which a handful of extremely wealthy people control not only our economy, but our political life as well.
Many others, including Hillary Clinton, parrot the same message.
Businesses and the rich in every country must pay their fair share of taxes and become full partners in a whole of society effort. True security cannot be funded on the backs of the poor.
So what is the fair share for the wealthy? It's nearly impossible to pin the left down on what that number is. It's simply more. More than the 42.6% in federal taxes currently being paid by those in upper income brackets. To the left, however, it's apparently entirely fair that 50% of Americans right now pay zero federal income tax, and some even enjoy what's called a negative tax rate. So again, what is fair? Is it the 94% income tax rate that was paid for several decades beginning in 1944? FDR thought so. He told Americans that paying higher taxes was a privilege.
In 1776, the fight was for democracy and taxation. In 1936, that is still the fight. Mr. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, "Taxes are the prices we pay for a civilized society." One sure way to determine the social conscience of a government is to examine the way taxes are collected and how they are spent. And one sure way to determine the social conscience of an individual is to get his tax reaction. Taxes, after all, are the dues that we pay for the privilege of membership in an organized society. And as society becomes more civilized, government, national and state and local, is called on to assume more obligations to its citizens.
He also believed at a time of great national danger, no American citizen ought to have a net income after he had paid his taxes of more than $25,000 a year. It seems reasonable to assume that Karl Marx would have agreed. The outrageously high taxes throughout the 30s and the 40s certainly didn't help America pull out of the worst depression in American history. As it stands in the United States right now, the top 1% of wage earners, those who are continually disparaged by the leftists in America, bring home nearly 18% of the nation's income. But they pay 35% of all federal income taxes. That would seem to some to be almost double their fair share. So what happens when the tax rate is raised significantly? Whether it's the income tax rate or the capital gains tax, does it actually help an economy? Even when Barack Obama was asked, he could not answer that question yes. During the 2008 presidential debate, Charlie Gibson confronted presidential candidate Obama with the facts that when the rate is lower, revenue goes up. So why raise it?
When the rate dropped, revenues from the tax increased. The government took in more money. And in the 1980s, When the tax was increased to 28%, the revenues went down. So why raise it at all, especially given the fact that 100 million people in this country own stock and would be affected?
Well, Charlie, what I've said is that I would look at raising the capital gains tax for purposes of fairness. We saw an article today which showed that the top 50 hedge fund managers made $29 billion last year. $29 billion for 50 individuals. And part of what has happened is that those who are able to work the stock market and amass huge fortunes on capital gains are paying a lower tax rate than their secretaries. That's not fair.
It's also not reasonable to confuse the lower percentage rate of the capital gains tax, which is a double tax, since the money being taxed was already taxed initially as income and then again as gain on investment. To confuse capital gains taxes with income taxes isn't logical, reasonable, or fair. Study after study has shown that taxes, income, and otherwise rise when revenue falls. When taxes are lowered, it stimulates the economy and brings in more revenue. The Roaring '20s are an excellent example. Tax rates were slashed dramatically during the 1920s, dropping from over 70% to less than 25%. So what happened? Personal income tax revenues increased from $719 million in 1921 to $1,164 million in 1928, an increase of more than 61%. Increasing taxes also hurts the tax base, as oftentimes people and businesses flee higher tax states for lower tax states. Just one example is New Jersey. Between 2005 and 2014, more than 2 million people left the state because of high taxes, taking with them billions of dollars in income and economic activity. This according to the Business and Industry Association. They estimate that it cost New Jersey $18 billion in net adjusted gross income, $11.4 billion in economic activity, $4.2 billion in labor income, and $8.4 billion in household spendings. Oh, and the loss of 75,000 jobs. That's a total of $42 billion in lost revenue for the state. Another example is New York, where 3.4 million people left during the first decade of this century, taking tens of billions of dollars with them. Much of it going to Florida, a state with no income tax. In 2012, French socialist candidate for president François Hollande proposed a massive 75% income tax on the wealthiest citizens. It didn't go over well with some of France's most well-known millionaires.
French actor Gérard Depardieu has been personally handed his new Russian passport by the country's president, Vladimir Putin. The two met for dinner at the Black Sea coastal city of Sochi after Depardieu was granted Russian citizenship. The French movie star has been threatening to leave France over the proposed introduction of a 75% tax on earnings over €1 million. The Kremlin has been keen to let the world know about its 13% flat rate on income tax.
One of Hollande's advisors warned that it was too far of a socialist step, that it would cost France dearly in citizens and businesses, and it would turn into Cuba without the sun. The tax on the wealthiest French went over very well at first, with enough left-leaning citizens that it helped Hollande unseat President Nicolas Sarkozy. The class warfare worked, but the 75% income tax didn't. The tax revenue from the super tax was down significantly from the first year to the next, while the deficit skyrocketed another $97 billion. It didn't last a third year. In January of 2015, the French government quietly killed the tax. Even the left-leaning French people came to believe that a 75% tax was far too high of a burden to place even on their wealthiest countrymen. In America, Democratic hero JFK understood that lower taxes stimulated the economy, as he outlined in a speech in August of 1962.
The worst deficit comes from a recession. And if we can take the proper action in the proper time, this can be the most important step we could take to prevent another recession. That is the right kind of a tax cut, both for your family budget and the national budget, resulting from a permanent basic reform and reduction in our rate structure, a creative tax cut, creating more jobs and income, and eventually more revenue. And the right time for that kind of bill, it now appears, in the absence of an economic crisis today, and if the job is to be done in a responsible way, is January 1963. Such a bill will be presented to the Congress for action next year. It will include an across-the-board, top-to-bottom cut in both corporate and personal income taxes. It will include long-needed tax reform that logic and equity demand. And it will date that cut in taxes to take effect as of the start of next year, January 1963. The billions of dollars this bill will place in the hands of the consumer and our businessmen will have both immediate and permanent benefits to our economy.
Unfortunately, the facts that were once known among Democrats and even some Republicans are now apparently unknown. Historic lessons that were once learned have been unlearned. Instead, the mindset is now this.
What we have seen, George, in the last 30 years, as most Americans know, is a massive redistribution of wealth. Unfortunately, it's gone in the wrong direction. It's gone from the middle class and working families to Donald Trump and his friends, the top 0.1%. And yes, let me be very clear. If we're going to make public colleges and universities tuition-free, as I believe we have to do in the 21st century, yeah, we are going to have a tax on Wall Street speculation. Yes, we are going to ask Trump and his billionaire friends to pay more in taxes.
What rate?
Yes, we are going to end these. We'll come up with that rate, but it'll be a damn lot higher than it is right now. When you see the rich getting much, much richer, and in their effective tax rates, as Warren Buffett often reminds us, is lower than the effective tax rates of truck drivers and nurses, yeah, the wealthy have got to pay more, and corporations.
America has come a long way since the first income tax of 3% back in 1862. It's come a long way in terms of taxes allowed by the Founding Fathers. Tomorrow, we take a look at the tax policies of the presidents of the latter part of the 20th century and sneak a look into how much further Americans just might be willing to go.
Glenn Beck.
Since they became permanent in 1913, income taxes have taken quite a roller coaster ride. The income tax started at just 3% and eventually ballooned to 94% of the wealthiest Americans' salaries. Democrats are normally associated with higher tax rates, and in most cases, with good reason. However, in 1962, John F. Kennedy proposed a massive tax cut. Before him, from 1953 to 1961, Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower told Congress,
"No one would like a tax cut more than I would. And I'm quite sure that the United States people want a tax cut as soon as it can be done. And I'm certain also of this, that the American people also know what kind of standards they want in national security, the safety of their country, in the amounts invested for peace, and in the amounts invested for, you might say, raising or meeting the human requirements of our own people at home. Now, in some of these, like disaster relief, I have put recommendations before the Congress, asking that the states share in this, at least in a minor way, so as to get the efficiency of local responsibility, a local concern for the money that's spent into the thing. But there's all sorts of ways in which the federal government has been assuming responsibilities by law that, if continued, are just going to cost money. And it's just fatuous to get up and say we're just going to save all this money and then not do something about federal responsibilities already given to them.
Since the top tax rate under Eisenhower was 91%, he must have felt the American people's desire for spending on military and foreign aid far outweighed their need or desire for a tax cut. It's also true that the collector of taxes, the IRS, first brought into existence in the Civil War period and later revived in 1913, has been used on multiple occasions as a weapon by government officials. That was just one of the multitude of problems our founding fathers were concerned about. In allowing the United States government to grow so large and so powerful, it would now have the ability to use the many levers of power at its disposal to gain and keep power. It has led to corruption. With the massive amount of money and bureaucracy brought about by the collection of income taxes, the federal government has the ability to use a nearly all-powerful IRS to threaten its enemies. A few years later, with the presidential election of 1976 on the line, then President Gerald Ford and candidate Jimmy Carter battled over taxes in a debate, some of which sounds very similar to the rhetoric we hear today.
In view of the very large budget deficits that you have accumulated and that are still in prospect, how is it possible to promise further tax cuts and to reach your goal of balancing the budget?
At the time, Mr. Gannon, that I made the recommendation for a $28 billion tax cut, 3/4 of it to go to individual taxpayers and 25% to American business. I said at the same time that we had to hold the lid on federal spending, that for every dollar of a tax reduction, we had to have an equal reduction in federal expenditure, a one-for-one proposition. And I recommended that to the Congress with a budget ceiling of $395 billion, and that would have permitted us to have a $28 billion tax reduction.
Governor Carter, your response?
Well, Mr. Ford is changing considerably his previous philosophy. The present tax structure is a disgrace to this country. It's just a welfare program for the rich. As a matter of fact, 25% of the total tax deductions go for only 1% of the richest people in this country. And over 50% of the tax credits go for the 14% of the richest people in this country. When Mr. Ford first became president in August of 1974, the first thing he did in October was to ask for a $4.7 billion increase in taxes on our people in the midst of the heaviest recession since the Great Depression of the 1940s.
Carter's class warfare argument apparently resonated with enough Americans to help him win the election. Taxes remained over 70% under his administration. And as most Americans are no doubt aware, the economy under the great Jimmy Carter was the worst in peacetime since the Great Depression. Interest rates, unemployment, and inflation all skyrocketed under Carter. And Americans endured gas lines and shortages and a general dampening of American morale. Into this environment came a former actor, former governor of California, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Although his middle name, Wilson, was an ode by his parents to Woodrow Wilson, this man couldn't have been further from it. A true conservative, socially and fiscally. Reagan received advice from economists like Art Laffer and Milton Friedman. After his election in 1980, he promptly fought for and obtained for Americans a massive tax cut in 1981, lowering the top tax rate to 50%. After sparking the economy and pulling the United States out of its economic and morale malaise, he was ready to go for even more. In 1985, from the Oval Office, Reagan made this pitch on further tax cuts to his fellow Americans.
In 1981, our critics charged that letting you keep more of your earnings would trigger an inflationary explosion, send interest rates soaring, and destroy our economy. Well, we cut your tax rates anyway, by nearly 25%. And what that helped trigger was falling inflation, falling interest rates, and the strongest economic expansion in 30 years. Over the course of this century, our tax system has been modified dozens of times and in hundreds of ways. Yet most of those changes didn't improve the system. They made it more like Washington itself, complicated, unfair, cluttered with gobbledygook and loopholes designed for those with the power and influence to hire high-priced legal and tax advisors. But there's more to it than that. Some years ago, an historian, I believe, said that every time in the past when a government began taxing above a certain level of the people's earnings, trust in government began to erode. He said it would begin with efforts to avoid paying the full tax. This would become outright cheating and eventually a distrust and contempt of government itself until there would be a breakdown in law and order. Well, how many times have we heard people brag about clever schemes to avoid paying taxes, or watched luxuries casually written off to be paid for by somebody else, that somebody being you? I believe that in both spirit and substance, our tax system has come to be un-American. How would the proposal work? The present tax system has 14 different brackets of tax rates ranging from 11 to 50%. We would take a giant step toward an ideal system by replacing all that with a simple 3-bracket system with tax rates of 15, 25, and 35%. By lowering everyone's tax rates all the way up the income scale, each of us will have a greater incentive to climb higher, to excel, to help America grow. The power of these incentives would send one simple, straightforward message to an entire nation. America, go for it. To young Americans wondering tonight, where will I go? What will I do with my future? I have a suggestion. Why not set out with your friends on the path of adventure and try to start up your own business? Follow in the footsteps of those 2 college students who launched one of America's great computer firms from the garage behind their house. You too can help us unlock the doors to a golden future. You too can become leaders in this great new era of progress, the age of the entrepreneur.
He and his policies were derided by the left, derisively referred to as Reaganomics. He was mocked, called stupid, reckless, and senile. However, again, Reagan succeeded in lowering taxes. In fact, instead of 35% for the top rate, he actually lowered it even more, to just 28% in 1986. Once again, despite his critics, the American economy boomed. Today, many of the same people who reviled Ronald Reagan sing his praises. Up next, what are the prospects for taxes today and tomorrow?
Glenn Beck.
This is the Glenn Beck Program.
Proponents of high income taxes have long had one undeniable problem. The facts are not on their side. The fact is, when taxes go up, revenues go down. However, the answer to that problem for high taxation advocates is simple. Ignore it. Instead, they focus on fairness. They play on Americans' emotions, on envy. They change the argument. Just one example was Barack Obama discussing why he would raise capital gains taxes during the 2008 presidential campaign.
You have, however, said you would favor an increase in the capital gains tax. As a matter of fact, you said on CNBC, and I quote, "I certainly would not go above what existed under Bill Clinton, which was 28%. It's now 15%. That's almost a doubling if you went to 28%. But actually, Bill Clinton in 1997 signed legislation that dropped the capital gains tax to 20%. Right. And George Bush has taken it down to 15%. And in each instance, when the rate dropped, revenues from the tax increased. The government took in more money. And in the 1980s, when the tax was increased to 28%, the revenues went down. So why raise it at all, especially given the fact that 100 million people in this country own stock and would be affected?
Well, Charlie, what I've said is that I would look at raising the capital gains tax for purposes of fairness.
In an earlier segment, we noted that the top 1% of wage earners in America pay 35% of all federal income tax. Listen to that again. 1% pays 35%. But they bring home only 18% of the income. The bottom 47% of wage earners pay zero income tax. The current rate on Americans' top income bracket is 40%. Yet, somehow, the class warfare rhetoric continues unabated. Self-avowed socialist Bernie Sanders has been trying to flip the meaning of redistribution of wealth to make it sound as though the wealthy are stealing money from the poor, rather than the government taking money from the rich and giving it to whomever they choose.
What we have seen, George, in the last 30 years, as most Americans know, is a massive redistribution of wealth. Unfortunately, it's gone in the wrong direction. It's gone from the middle class and working families to Donald Trump and his friends, the top 0.1%. And yes, let me be very clear. If we're going to make public colleges and universities tuition-free, as I believe we have to do in the 21st century, yeah, we are going to have a tax on Wall Street speculation. Yes, we are going to ask Trump and his billionaire friends to pay more in taxes.
What rate?
Yes, we are going to end these. We'll come up with that rate, but it'll be a damn lot higher than it is right now.
Bernie Sanders has never provided details on how Donald Trump and his friends, or anyone in the top income brackets, have taken money from the middle class and working families, or how the fact that they have enormous amounts of money harms the middle and working class. Neither has he explained why, quote, we have to, in the 21st century, make college tuition free for all. That's a concept that America's founding fathers would never have agreed with. Ironically, the villain Sanders singles out so often in his class warfare salvos, in part, agrees with him. Donald Trump wanted a 14.25% wealth tax on the top wage earners several years ago. But even now, during this campaign, he has repeatedly said,
they pick a stock and all of a sudden, they make a lot of money. I want the hedge fund guys to pay more tax.
The third candidate for president of the United States involved in class warfare, Hillary Clinton, promises,
I'm going to do everything I can to make sure that the wealthy pay for debt-free tuition, for child care, for paid family leave.
Are any American Democrats asking themselves, should successful Americans be forced to pay for other people's children's debt-free college, child care, and family leave? Don't the parents of these children bear any responsibility? Don't the college students bear any responsibility for their own education? How is it fair to ask anyone to take care of their own family and everyone
cardio
else's?
and strength training.
Is
Hashtag
this still
Smoothie Love.
the United
Hanging with my
States
buddies.
of America?
Hashtag break time.
Look who
Presidential
Arnie brought with him.
Bernie
Hashtag
Sanders
beef
would
rappy.
prefer it not
Share
to
the
be.
news. Right now at
Ignoring the
McDonald's, get any
despotic
small
socialist
McCafe
states
drink
that
for
have
just
ended
$2.
so many
Caramel
times in
frappe,
death
strawberry
and
banana
destruction.
smoothie made with
Sanders
Chobani Greek
claims that
yogurt,
he wants
even
the United
shakes.
States to
Or
be
get a
more
medium
like
iced coffee for
Denmark,
$2.
Sweden,
All
or
just
Norway.
as delicious as the places that charge you a fortune.
Heading to McDonald's. Hashtag $2 is better.
Price and participation may vary. Limited time offer.
Working people.
Sanders never mentioned
To just
that
drill ground
all
rules
of
for
those
tonight, if there's a
countries
minor
became
disturbance,
prosperous
there is not going to be an
through
action. You do it
capitalism
again,
during the
we'll throw you
19th and
out.
20th century. He never mentioned that since instituting their socialist and socialist programs, the economies of each have stalled. He never mentioned
If
that
there
the
is
more
a continuous
successful
disruption,
citizens pay
Dinesh will be escorted from the
enormous
stage and will
tax
not continue until everyone
and
settles
he
down.
never mentions that the
Our guest tonight is a
lifestyle they
conservative,
live in
intellectual
these countries
giant,
is
author and
far
filmmaker,
below
Dinesh
that
D'Souza.
enjoyed by Americans.
Mr. D'Souza was born and raised in Mumbai,
Scandinavian
India, before
countries
coming to the
have
United
a
States in
much lower
1978.
income than Americans,
He was educated in
and
Dartmouth College.
much
Dr.
lower
Crockett taught me how
take-home
to
pay.
correctly pronounce that.
Less disposable
where he
income
graduated with a
means
bachelor's degree in
less
English.
stimulation
Later
of
he
the
became a
economy.
John M.
It
Holland
also
Fellow
means
at the
smaller
American
homes.
Enterprise Institute
In
and the
Sweden,
Robert and
the
Karen
average
Rishwan
size of
Fellow
a new
at the
home
Hoover
is
Institute at Stanford
902
University.
square feet.
Throughout his career,
In the
Mr. D'Souza
US,
has been a strong
the average home
advocate
is over
for conservative and
2,400
Christian
square
principles.
feet.
In the late
Less income
1980s, he
means
served as a
fewer
policy
amenities
analyst in the
for
Reagan White
individuals
House
and families.
before becoming a U.S.
Do
citizen in
students in Denmark
1991.
and other Scandinavian countries receive free education? Yes, but only on the backs of others.
In Denmark,
Mr. D'Souza was one of the leading defenders of Christianity during the rise of the New Atheism movement. He publicly debated some of the most prominent intellectuals at the time, including the late Christopher Hitchens, who called Dinesh D'Souza one of the most articulate opponents.
Quite a bit.
Dinesh D'Souza is the author of numerous books,
So it's
including
not for
the...
free. I do believe that the size of the government, in terms of how much taxes we have to pay, means that it's putting brakes on economic growth. I think that is clearly the case.
How do you feel about handing more than half of your paycheck over to the government?
Well, quite furious on a personal level.
And by the way, the minimum wage of $15 that is so cherished by Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton is non-existent in Denmark.
We don't have a government-regulated minimum wages in Denmark. If you want to work for less than $15, as Bernie Sanders suggests, you can easily do that in Denmark.
In the United States, McDonald's is used in the debate over minimum wage. In Denmark, there is no minimum wage.
Leaders of these European countries would want Americans to know that their economies are actually, in some cases, freer, less regulated than in the U.S. right now, and that the socialist programs are such a drag on the economy that they are now going the other way, toward less socialism. Also, while Sanders and Clinton look to Europe for economic answers, Europeans, as always, continue to look to America. In Sweden, the effective marginal tax rate once hit 100% under certain circumstances. In fact, the IKEA founder left the country because of it in 1973. During the past few decades, the attitude and legislation has turned against socialism, just like in France. Sweden's tax rates have actually fallen, and the founder of IKEA has returned now to his own country. Republican presidential candidate Ted Cruz has a different plan.
My simple flat tax is exactly what it says. It's a flat tax of 10% for everybody. And what it would produce is incredible economic growth. The Nonpartisan Tax Foundation estimates that this would produce 4.9 million new jobs, that this would increase capital investments, things like new factories, by 44%, and that the after-tax income of every single income group in America would go up by double digits, at least 14%.
America faces a choice. Bernie Sanders' plan is to raise taxes by, quote, a damn lot, end quote, and redistribute the wealth. As a result of his plan to institute so many socialist policies like free college education for everyone, he will have to raise taxes across the board. For the wealthiest, some speculate that since he has referenced the 90% rate under Eisenhower multiple times, that may be the figure he has in mind. Hillary Clinton's plan is also to raise taxes on the wealthy and redistribute the wealth. Donald Trump's plan is to raise taxes on the wealthy and redistribute the wealth. The Ted Cruz plan is to cut taxes for everyone, institute a flat 10% tax with taxpayers under $50,000 paying zero, and eliminate the IRS, which would also eliminate the threat of the executive branch of government ever using it as a weapon again against its enemies. As Americans finalize their taxes for 2015 and go to the polls during the primary season and the general election, they are confronted with a clear choice. Perhaps the clearest choice in American history. Does America become more like Denmark and Sweden, or go back to being more like the United States of America?
Glenn Beck.